I didn't do it while we were recording. All right, has everybody signed in? If you haven't, please do that. Use the chat for that. Let me close that down. Okay, there we go. Okay, we reviewed a little bit last time. I got a chance to look really quickly at the results from the Module 1 assignment. This turned out to be a week from hell, so I doubt very seriously that I'm going to be able to finish grading those before the weekend. I'm really hoping that nothing happens this weekend so that I can catch up on grading, okay? And I'm sorry about that, but I think I mentioned this before. If I didn't, if for some reason you're particularly concerned about how you may have done on that assignment and you email me, I can sort of push you to the front of the queue and finalize your grade before I do anyone else's, or at least give you an estimated grade. What that means is that I may do the preliminary grading. You've got a certain score on that. It's not going to go down. It could go up a little bit, but at least you'll know what your base score would be. So if you're worried about it, just let me know. Shoot me an email. My email address is on the syllabus, and I'll do that. I'll grade them as quickly as I can, but I don't like to rush through grading. I don't like to be sloppy about that. Now, we're shifting gears a little bit going into this notion of the roots of Western political thought. And a couple of you clearly from last discussion had already read ahead, which was really great. But I felt like I should put the brakes on a little bit. I was really reluctant to inject a bunch of new information when you were trying to review for an assignment. But now we can do that. I would have hoped, although I know you just had an assignment, but normally I would hope that you would have read ahead a little bit. I'd like you to look at the video called What is Justice? That's a real brief summary of the general philosophical architecture of the Republic as it pertains to this class. What I tried to do is these are the highlights of what's really important at the introductory level, okay? Rather than try to give you an exhaustive, comprehensive summary of everything. And also, I really try to keep those videos somewhere in the 2 to 5 minute range. If they get any longer than that, I find people sort of stop watching. There are just too many other things to look at. So I understand that. I try to keep them as summaries. Also, the notes that I've linked you to, the Spark Notes, these used to be of really uneven quality, but whoever's doing Spark Notes now, I think they got a bunch of graduate students doing it, but they're taking it more seriously. And these are pretty good interpretations of the general ideas. I mean, I can kind of nibble away at the edges on some of this stuff like a snarky graduate student or something, but this gives you kind of an idea of what, in this case, what's going on with Plato's Republic. And again, it's only that summary. That's really all there is to look at. It's only, what is it, about 8-9 paragraphs or something like that. It's not a lot. You can skim it. You can measure that against the stuff that you find in the video, and it should be pretty easy for you to get a general understanding of what Plato was having Socrates tell us with respect to the Republic, okay? All I wanted to do today is just give you a general introduction to it. The first thing that's kind of important there is the reason why Plato writes this in the first place. And the idea is he's being asked this question. He writes this almost like the dialogues from a play, okay? Because at that time, in terms of the arts, theater was kind of considered as right there with poetry. They were all of a piece. What we would call literature, poetry, and theater were all considered sort of, the poetics or something like that. And the idea is that those were considered to be very refined and powerful ways of conveying ideas. Writing in that way. And Plato was really kind of a master at it. Okay, so what he's trying to do is he has these people talking with this fictional character of Socrates who sort of resembles the real deal, but we don't know for sure exactly what the deal was with Socrates. But we have a sort of sketchy outline. Anyway, and they're asking him about what justice is. How do you know when you're doing things and then that objectively could be assessed as either just or unjust? How do you know? And before we get into that, how do you know? Where do we get our ideas of justice? Where does the notion of justice come from? I don't mean, the etymology of the word, but, this idea that some things are just and some things are unjust. Where does that come from? You adults. who are getting ready to vote? Justice.
From institutions?
Well, that's sort of the sanitized textbook response, but you know, everything comes from institutions in that sense, Owen. You know, what is, how do we know what justice is? Where did we learn this?
From our parents,
I mean,
as we were raised. I don't
How
know
do
if
your
that's
parents
what
teach
they-
you justice?
by saying what's right and wrong. Like, hey, I tried stealing a tip when I was 6 off a table. They said, hey, that's wrong. You need to put that back, and then punished me.
Now, but
Where-
again, did they say that it was a crime or that it was unjust? Because the idea here is those might be distinct. One of the comments in the chat said from religion. The notion of right and wrong is a lot older than organized religion. Okay, it goes back to really prehistoric and pre-religious ideas like taboos and allowances for things to be done or not be done. How would we know those things? Why would our parents know, as Evan suggests, that something is right or wrong? On the basis, who says it's right or wrong? I mean, if my children are starving and I have two alternatives, I either steal in order to feed them or I let them starve, what should I do? What would be a just thing to do?
feed your children.
Feed your children, but if I have to steal to do it, then, you know, the suggestion here is that I would be unjust.
It's a considered moral judgment.
So is
you should have to
justice
think
really a
about it.
considered moral judgment?
Our sense of it is, I'd
And
say.
is that how you would define, Ross, is that how you would define justice for today's discussion? I'm not trying to pin you down, but would you say that a working definition of justice might be a considered moral judgment?
No, that's just how I would figure out how something is just, like, in my life, I'd say. I don't know. It's not the overarching definition of it. For
Okay,
sure.
well, is justice personal?
It can be. There's some things that are.
Can it really? And still be
It
just?
shouldn't be.
Who said it? Did somebody say it shouldn't be?
Yes, Sarah.
Oh, there you go. Okay. You said it should not be personal,
No,
or you said it,
'Cause-
or you said it should be. I couldn't tell.
no, it should not be.
Okay, it should not be. Why not? Why should justice not be personal?
Because it's got to apply to a society as a whole, not the individual.
Well, that's the general notion that the notion of justice is not about personal decision making necessarily. In other words, it's about what a society accepts as right or wrong.
Right.
That's normally what we think about with justice, is that, in other words, individuals very, very, very rarely are expected to sit and run the whole ethical calculus of what is or is not just by knowing what the law is and when you violated the law, and then knowing beyond law, knowing what ethics are and knowing what morality is. I don't think we consciously think of those things before we make choices, okay? In fact, typically what happens is we do things, often impulsively, sometimes completely non-reflexively, and then we realize only later on, gee, I probably shouldn't have done that. When we reach that point of, I probably shouldn't have done that, what went wrong? Why do we do that? We've all done that. We've done something that at the time, either we didn't care, or we'd had one beer too many, or we were angry, or we just didn't know. And then later, you know what? I probably shouldn't have done that. Why? I mean, you did it. Own it. Be done with it. Who cares? It's done. Why do we worry about it? Why do we catch ourselves and think, oh, I should not have done that. That was wrong. How do we know? Who tells us?
Isn't it more of like a societal situation?
Well, I
Like
think
as a
it is.
society, we have our
Yeah.
opinions.
I think that's what Sarah was trying to say too, is that we know because it's reflected back at us, right? We see socially the consequences of what we've done, right? We see the harm we've done is reflected back at us from the people to whom we've harmed, right? Or we come to realize, oh no, I did not know there's a social contract here that says I can't do that, or I should not do that, or if I do that, there's a consequence for it. I did not know that. Or I did not care, or whatever. But generally, justice is considered to have a social function, and to function as a kind of an ethical code in society. Now, this is where Plato comes in. The original question is, how does the individual know? Where does individual justice reside? How do we know when, as individuals, we are being just? That is, that we are ethically or morally correct in our actions. What Plato does is kind of deal with what we're doing right now. He's dealing with the question and the issue as Ross frames it, as a kind of individual decision that's made. Ross, if I'm understanding you correctly, that you make individual decisions because you do run a kind of personal calculus in which you ultimately decide whether or not you're going to take a certain action or not, okay? But he says there's so many complications at the individual level that it's hard to see what the nature of that decision really is. So he says, let's make our model bigger so it's easier to see the elements of justice. Let's look at an entire city instead of just the individual within the city. Okay, first of all, does that make sense what I'm saying? What he's trying to do here is he's trying to magnify the issue so that we can look more carefully at the details of it, at the construction of it. Oh, now I can see it better because I can see it writ large as a society, rather than trying to figure out how does a discrete individual make right or wrong decisions. Does that make sense? Okay.
I feel like he kind of also questions, like, why be just and moral? Because at least when he was learning from Socrates, because he thought, like, Plato found Socrates to be a just and moral man, but he was forced to kill himself.
Well, that's
basically.
isn't that part of what he's kind of trying to resolve here, right?
Alright.
It's also why Plato hated democracy. Okay, and why, by the way, almost every society has hated democracy, including the people who framed this republic. They hated democracy. This is why there's a fear of the mob, and that the mob is not going to behave in a way that's just unless, he would have us believe, they're sort of properly schooled in what real justice is. So that's what we're kind of dealing with. Left to their own devices, the untutored mob is going to be there. It's going to be nothing. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be chaos and anarchy and violence, and anybody who has any kind of possessions of any kind is going to be dispossessed of those things by a poor, angry mob that's going to resent them for their wealth and their education and their leisure and everything else. And there's going to be rebellion and atonal music and, people turning the amps up to 11 and all this terrible stuff. And to avoid that, we have to teach justice in the city. First, we have to identify it. We have to model it. So what he's trying to do is blow it up big enough so that all these people can see it, and then say, okay, let's look at the big model. Let's look at the city. He's arguing that justice is essential in the city, is a kind of harmonizing of the proper elements of a healthy, well-constructed society. You'll know a healthy society by the way the various forces within that society are or are not properly balanced. And so he gives us this kind of pyramid of authority, and he institutionalizes that in 3 cohorts in society. Now, let's be real clear about this, okay? First of all, this isn't the same as socioeconomic class. In other words, this isn't like poor, working class, middle class, wealthy, whatever. It's not, that's not how proper authority is institutionalized in the healthy city that he's talking about. So what he says is there are these 3 parts of society properly balanced that will create and sustain a healthy city. And he says the base of that, if you've had a chance to look at the video, then this is a review. The base of that is what he sort of kind of glibly refers to as producers, okay? That's pretty much all of us, okay? In other words, our job is to create and sustain the material needs of society, right? We create and satisfy those needs. That is, we build the things, the material things primarily that society needs. We grow the food, although remember, these were slave societies too. So let's say we supervise the people who grow the food. we build the houses, we build the roads, we build all the wonderful architecture and everything else. And so every city has these material needs. We satisfy those. Why do we do it? Because of what motivates us more than anything else. And what motivates us is this sort of material hunger, right? Particularly for wealth, that we value wealth. And it's a good thing that we do. Since we value wealth, we'll work hard for it. And in the process of working hard for it, we'll make nice shoes for you, and we'll make nice roads and houses for you, and all these things that society needs. So that's the single largest part, at least among the citizenry, not counting slaves, of a society, is what he calls the producers. Okay? Now, for somebody who maybe has read ahead a little bit, what comes next? What's right above that stratum? Think about a kind of a pyramid that has layers, 3 layers to it. What's the next level of society?
The like auxiliaries, the people who uphold the rulers.
All right, now who are we talking about with the auxiliaries? What's their job? What do they do?
They're kind of like, I think they were kind of like the warriors, kind of
Yeah.
like the
Right.
type of,
So,
not military, but kind of. in
yeah,
that-
no, they would be the military. You're right. No, they would be the military. Remember too, the notion of a separate domestic police force, that's modern. That's almost 20th century. So the same people who picked up spears against the enemy from without pointed those same spears against the enemy within. So you're right. No, the warriors would be the people who protected the republic. And that might involve going to war. It might involve policing the streets, but they're enforcing the law. Okay. Now, what separates them, do you think, from the producers? Clearly they're very different people, because we don't want producers doing that. I mean, you don't want me being a police officer. Never mind that I don't make the height requirement. You don't want me doing that. I don't have the proper motivation. I talk too much. So what's different between, according to Plato, what's different that makes this important distinction between the very large class of producers and the much smaller class of the auxiliaries or warriors or whatever they are? What's different?
Wouldn't the function of the classes be different? Like
Okay.
every class has its specific function?
Right. You're almost thinking about these classes as though they were institutional arrangements of authority. If you are, you're absolutely correct. So if you're thinking in terms of nature and function, okay, the nature of producers is to be motivated by the desire for wealth, okay? Why? Because their function is to produce the things that generate wealth and use that wealth productively. If the function of the warriors is kind of what Lily, I think, was suggesting, which is protection, right? Enforcing the law and protecting the republic. On the basis of what nature? What is their nature? It's not, they don't desire wealth. They have no interest in wealth. But what does motivate them? What is the core of their nature, according to Plato? Desire for what?
Or
Sorry.
power?
No, they absolutely do not want power. No. Remember, you don't want the police to want power. You want them to want to protect it. So what do these warriors, auxiliaries, in other words, if wealth motivates the producers, and that's the core of their spirit, that's their driving force that gets them up in the morning, gets them to go out and do the hard work they need to do, to enjoy, the product of their labor and make sure that everybody else has the things they need because it creates wealth and makes a wealthy society. What is the thing that drives the auxiliary?
Justice?
It's not. It's not.
Okay.
It's not that they're unjust, but they're not the source of
Right.
justice. They're the protectors of it. But they're driven by a particular motivation, according to Plato. He defines it as
Would it be a motivation to,
Go ahead.
sorry,
So no, I'm sorry. We got a
Would it
little
be
light.
a-
Go ahead.
would it be like the motivation would be like crime because they need to
No,
like create just, okay, never mind.
no, it wouldn't, because they don't aspire to be criminal. What I'm saying is,
Well, I mean,
what
but
are they-
like to stop crime.
Okay, somebody got it. Sir, it's spirit or will. What they crave, okay, is honor. They want honor, and the ultimate honor for them is protecting the city. Honor and glory, yes. They want honor. They want to, in other words, they don't want it in a vainglorious way. They don't want the power of it. They want the distinction that comes from sacrificing on behalf of the city. Okay, they would want to be honored as heroes, not for the vanity of it, but to know they've done their job properly. Okay, that their will and their spirit were enough to give them the distinction of protecting the city as only they can. So they're just as the material desire, the appetite of the producers is what motivates them, to want to create wealth. The desire, the will and the spirit of the auxiliary or warrior is what motivates them. They want that glory and that honor. They want to do the right thing by the city, and knowing that that is their function. That is their natural role, because that's the function in society for which they are naturally suited. So their nature is motivation on the basis of spirit or will. The function is the protection of the city. So I like that Isabel reminded us to use those criteria of nature and function. You can understand Plato's Republic at this level much better by remembering those two elements at each stratum of society. So we have two of the three here. We have the producers. They're motivated by appetite especially for wealth, and of course beer, and that gets them to produce all these great things that the city needs. Then smaller stratum above them of people who have no desire for material wealth. Indeed, they live communally. This is communism in this stratum. Men and women live together, train together. There's functionally no difference between them. They do not raise their children individually. All children are raised in common. There's no sense of being parents, because ultimately you are a servant of the state. And your children will not be raised as your children. They will be raised as servants of the state. The important function of which is to protect the state, thus gaining honor and glory. Okay, so there's two of the, now what's the little tiny peak of the pyramid in this model that Plato's outlining for us? We got producers, auxiliaries of warriors, and then we got this other thing. What's up there?
It's
The rulers.
The rulers. What does Plato call the rulers?
Guardians.
Philosophers.
They are philosophers. He refers to them as guardians. What are they guarding? Now remember, these aren't the warriors. They're not just physically protecting the city. What are they in charge of? What is their, before we get to their nature, what's their function? What's missing from this equation so far?
The overall ruler who basically says that, they have their own convictions, and that's how things are going to go. Like, they're the head of everything.
Okay, I'm going to refine that just a tiny bit. This is the stratum of rule. That's right. But it's not their own convictions. This is not personal rule. And the distinction, Isabel, is important, okay? This is what they discovered that is the universal truth. They believe in a universal truth, which will reveal to them what is right and wrong, including, of course, what is just. They pursue that because of the motivation they have. The motivation they have is the pursuit of wisdom, okay? They're not governed they don't care about wealth. They don't care about honor and glory. Indeed, as rulers, they're reluctant rulers. You have to convince them. No, we need you with all of your wisdom. You don't want the ambitious ruler. You want the wisest ruler. And that typically is not the most ambitious. But because they have devoted their lives and their considerable intellect and their training and their leisure to these fundamental questions of right and wrong and, the nature of the world as philosophers in pursuit of the truth rather than personal glory or personal wealth or personal anything. These are ultimately selfless people. All they're interested in is the truth. and they believe it to exist. Okay, so their function is rule. Their nature is wisdom. That's what motivates them, the pursuit of the truth. What is wise? I don't know. I have to think about it. I have to observe the world. I have to deliberate with my colleagues. We'll let you know. We'll get back to you. All right? So do you see how that works? In other words, and I'm really glad that Isabel reminded us of this. You can look at each of these levels of society as having a distinct and particular nature and function. What then, if we've done that, what then Plato would say is, okay, now try to take a step back from that and understand the complementarity between these divisions, okay? You can't have any kind of a human settlement without producers, okay? We need those material things that only the producers can really do well, properly, okay? But we also need protection. The producers can't do that because they're busy producing, and also because it's not in their nature, okay? They're not cowards. It's just that that's not in their, they're not natural fighters. They're natural builders. They don't want to destroy things. They want to create them, okay? So you go with the people who have tremendous spirit and courage and will, and who desire the honor that can only come from sacrifice of the self for the good of the city. Again, they're not looking for personal vain glory. They understand that the kind of glory and honor they're going to receive may very well come after they're gone as a consequence of their dying in order to save the city. And they don't just accept that, they live for that, okay? And so they have a very different nature, and as a consequence of their different nature, there's an entire stratum of expectations that we assign to them that we would never assign to the producers. It wouldn't be natural to do that. In fact, it would be a disharmony. If you had producers picking up weapons, you'd have chaos. In other words, I'm not saying he's right or wrong. I'm saying, do you see his logic? Do you see his thinking? Okay. And then finally, you need somebody or some small cohort of people who can kind of guide all of this and in a very impersonal way, a very dispassionate way, contemplate and observe these two strata, keep them in harmony, and be guided in that action by your understanding of what is true. That is what is wisest, is that which is true. Okay? So that's kind of what the Republic is. That's now what he then says is, okay, if we wanted to revisit the notion of justice in the individual, we would find that the individual society is constructed the same way. That at the individual level, okay, what makes us just is the proper balance of the virtues of our souls. There is a virtue of our soul that is appetite, just as there is with the producers. Every individual needs to have a certain motivation to do things, a certain hunger, okay, and a certain desire for achievement, particularly material achievement, okay? Otherwise, we just won't do anything, okay? And to completely ignore that, if it is our nature, is wrong. Now, if that becomes a predominant virtue, we're more likely to be a natural producer, okay? But if that virtue is tempered by the virtue of will and self-sacrifice and spirit, characteristic of a warrior, okay, and that is a stronger virtue in our soul than appetite, then we are more naturally suited to be auxiliaries or warriors. And finally, if in fact we may possess a balance of the virtues of appetite and will such that neither overpowers the other, the predominant, and this is rare, the predominant virtue of our soul is the pursuit of wisdom. It is that desire and for an ability to contemplate dispassionately, to observe systematically, and to draw conclusions that yield the wisdom about what is the true nature of existence, what is the true nature of the individual, what is the true and proper nature of the city, which means, and that's going to be a tiny minority of people, guess what? We are naturally philosophers. We are naturally part of that upper stratum. Okay, and the idea of being just is you understand your true nature. You keep in balance and harmony all of the virtues of your soul, but you understand that which is most profound, that motivates you, and you follow that motivation and you be that thing. If you are a natural producer, you don't aspire to be a warrior. You don't aspire to be a guardian. You take joy in being a producer, and therefore you are just. Okay, does that make sense? In other words, it's this notion of harmonizing the various elements of the individual soul in the same way that we have to harmonize and balance properly the various strata or classes, if you want to, of the entire city. That's kind of the lesson that Plato's trying to teach us. Now, there can be a lot wrong with that, but my main concern now is that you understand what he's trying to do and how he's going about doing it. Are there any basic questions on the architecture of this as he outlines it?
This all just something caught my mind. This all assumes that no one is striving for power, right?
Not in the sense of domination, right? That's right.
Yeah, which is very unrealistic, but.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if it is. Do you strive for power?
No, I wouldn't specifically, but.
Who here strives for power? You want to dominate people. You want to be boss. You want to make all the decisions for everybody. You want to rule. First of all, very few people do. Jason raises a great point, though, okay? There clearly is no obvious, I mean, you could not have, for example, a producer who becomes what we would see as like a billionaire who then goes into politics or something. There's no place for that. Because if you're a producer, you stay as a producer and you stay out of rule. But also, Plato's larger concern here is that the person driven by personal ambition is not the best person to rule. Okay. If you're driven by personal ambition, it's probably tantamount either to just acknowledge my greatness, that is, make me a warrior, I will sacrifice there, or, let me be a producer because, I'll get all kinds of praise and wealth and everything for all the cool wealth that I create and the products that I create with it. So, he's assuming that no, it's not natural that any significant number of people really want power. In fact, a lot of people have argued, not only then, but now, that the people who are most blindly ambitious often display a lot of the traits that we normally associate with psychopathy. That there's a kind of psychopathic element to this drive for power that certainly in Plato's time would have been considered an aberration. It would have been considered wrong. Okay. Now remember, Jason, we're just thinking about Plato's time, first of all. We haven't tried to move this forward to the 21st century. Clearly, it doesn't fit very well in the 21st century. It fit much better. And so your comment's much more apropos today than it would have been in Plato's time when, societies were naturally stratified and most people never aspired to rule. They just knew they weren't fit for it. Okay. And again, this is why Plato has such contempt for democracy. It is actually a corruption. It's a corruption of virtue by convincing people who are not possessed of the virtue of wisdom that they're fit to rule. Okay, does that make sense? In other words, your point is perfectly valid. It just doesn't quite apply in Plato's time in the same way that it would, in the obvious way that it would now. Okay, now again, even in Plato's time, there were a lot of people who disagreed with him and thought he was really wrong. Because this, as far as we know, was also the teaching of Socrates. Well, obviously, he was found guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens just by telling them these ideas and being persuasive about them. And that was enough to take his life. What was his other alternative if he didn't kill himself? He was given two choices, or a choice of two things. One of them was drink this hemlock and die. What was the other one?
Wouldn't it probably be to stop spreading your opinion?
Well, they knew he wasn't
Like
going to. They knew he wasn't going to. What was
Right.
the other option they gave him? I'm sorry.
To get exiled?
To leave. All he had to do was leave.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah. Either you got to leave, which is sort of like stuff. In other words, if you're going to be here, okay, you're going to teach. We know you're going to teach. We don't trust you not to teach. We know you too well, Socrates. You either have to leave or you have to die. And he chose to die rather than leave. Now, part of that is, before we over-romanticize this, one of the worst punishments in the time of Socrates was exile. Why? It was almost a death sentence. It could almost be a death sentence. I mean, if somebody tells me I have to leave Ashland, I'm not going to let the door hit me in the ass on the way out, you know? I don't care. I don't have to worry about being exiled from some retirement colony in Southern Oregon. That doesn't bother me. Okay? And so, you know, if somebody says, hey, Bill, you either got to stop teaching these students and leave, or we're going to kill you. It's like, well, no, you're not going to kill me. Sorry, students, I'm leaving. I'll see you on Zoom, right? But if you were exiled from the city, you know, remember that these weren't just towns. These were what were called city-states. These were armed camps. And not too far away from them was Sparta. Okay, well, they've been to war with Sparta. They didn't always get along with Sparta. When Plato designed the auxiliary or warrior class, he had Sparta in mind. That's the way Spartans lived. Okay, so he would have had to hope that one of these other city-states would allow him in. And with his reputation, the likelihood was next to nothing. So, I mean, a lot of people are very impressed by the fact that rather than continue the virtue of his teaching, he was willing to take his own life. Well, the alternative was to be shunned, to be exiled, and in a dangerous situation. He probably could have found a way to survive, but it wouldn't have just been a minor inconvenience. It would have changed fundamentally his ability to do anything. The other thing to think about is he had no job. You know, I mean, if he got paid for some of his tutoring, often without admitting it, but he was poor. He had no wealth of any kind. You know, he would have had to leave town with just what he could carry. And so, you know, it was a severe punishment, but he did choose to take his own life. Okay. The main thing here is it's pretty clear, at least as far as Plato is concerned, justice exists in isolation of what any individual might think. This is part of Plato that a lot of people don't understand. Plato believed in something called the forms, you know, and these forms were these ideal manifestations of virtues. Okay, like not just that, oh, somewhere out there in the universe, there is the perfect table. It's not so much that. It's like those things that are nature exist in a pure, perfect form. Things like justice. The virtues actually exist. They're tangible, okay? And that the job of the philosopher was to go looking for those pure forms, find them, learn their nature, and then take that knowledge back to the people. And so some of you may have heard of this, but it's where Plato got the idea for what's called the allegory of the cave. And the idea is, this is why he would consider that only the philosophers are really fit to rule, okay? First of all, because they don't want to. But secondly, because they're mentally and temperamentally best equipped for it. Because rule requires an understanding of the truth as a virtue. So the idea of the allegory of the cave, that's part of the Republic, is I'm kind of oversimplifying, that all of us here, the mere mortals here, it's like we're sitting in a cave, right? And there's a fire behind us, okay? We can't see the fire or anything else behind us. We're stuck in place. Walking between the fire and us would be, for example, and this was very much the way a lot of theater was done, were people who carry like these sort of outlines of various things. Like, oh, this is justice, or this is whatever. So we only see these dim, flickering shadows of what these things are. And that's the most that we can know, because all we can see is the wall in front of us and what's projected onto that wall as a consequence of the fire and anything that comes between us and the fire. Okay? Image in your head, right? Very crappy movie, that kind of thing. What the philosopher does is find a way to break those chains, all right, turn around, leave the cave, understanding that what we've been seeing is not real, okay? It's not real. It's a kind of image of what might be, but it's not a reflection of the real ideal form in the sense that we need to understand it as philosophers. The only way you can find that is to leave the cave and go out into the world of forms. In that world of forms, you will discover the true nature of things, okay? Because you'll see them as they really are, rather than as these flickering, indistinct reflections on the wall, which is what most people have, okay? Then as a philosopher, your obligation to the people is to go back to the cave. Even now that you've got pure knowledge in front of you and how intoxicating that must be, you've got to go back into the cave and try to convince people who can't see what you saw and never will. You have to convince them of what is true and what is real. And that's the philosopher. And that's why you pursue the truth, to liberate people's minds from this slavish dependence on these images, these indistinct and often fraudulent images of right and wrong, good and bad, all the various virtues, okay? The architecture of the Republic is supposed to be based on that idea of guiding people toward just behavior. So there's obviously going to be a huge role for education and domestic propaganda. There's going to be a purifying of all the poetics and everything. I mean, there are things, he gets as specific as to say that musicians will only be able to play in certain modes, right? Because other modes are, too weak or frivolous or, too melancholy. Like Dorian mode was enjoyed because, it's kind of martial and stern and dark and bold and all that. But nothing frivolous, nothing decorative, nothing superficial, which leaves out a hell of a lot of good music, since my favorite mode is Mixolydian. All right. Marion, do you have your hand up or were you just flexing? Okay, sorry. So in other words, there's going to be a tremendous amount of control of people. In other words, there's an absolutist notion of, we know what's true, we're going to teach you that and only that. Any artist, any poet, playwright, anybody who doesn't get with that program faces the same fate as Socrates. They got to leave, because this city is going to be purified and made philosophically whole. Do you see how some people could see this as the beginnings of totalitarianism? It's like, wait a minute, you mean I can't even question this? No, you can't. Your nature is to make shoes, Bill. That's all you're going to do. Or just be quiet and be a school teacher. And that's what you do. You're helping people create wealth because they get education and they're more productive and it's better for society. Don't start asking questions. Just do what you're told. And by the way, stop listening to that music, because I heard that Lydian mode in there and that ain't cool. We don't use that stuff. We do not play that. Okay. That's important. That's the Republic. It is an absolutist view of society. Could you see, for example, how it is militantly anti-democratic? Okay, this is not a democratic culture that he's talking about, because democracy is corruption by definition. It's mob rule. Okay. So generally speaking, are there any questions about this? I'm just trying to give you the kind of flyover. Go ahead now, if you haven't already, and watch the brief video. I think it's only a few minutes, and then look over the notes, fill in the blanks here a little bit, familiarize yourself with this. But does that as an overview make sense to you? Again, Jason raised a perfectly legitimate objection, for the 21st century, but at the time at which he's doing this, there was a desperate need to stabilize Athens. Many people, particularly affluent people and those who worked with them, like Plato, were terrified of the mob and the decadence and chaos that they represented. And so the idea was, we've got to keep them from taking, this jury system, this Athenian jury thing just doesn't work. We've got to find a better way to administer justice, because these are unjust people. They don't understand justice. They're insufficiently wise. Okay. Is there anything else? Okay, if there's nothing else, then I'll leave you to it. I'll post this, so if you need to review, or if you know anybody missed it, you might remind them, okay, he's going to post the class. If I mention this in my classes periodically, some of you are not comfortable participating in class, and I understand that. It would be better if you would get a handle on that, but I'm not going to force you. But you may still have questions. And so please, at the very least, give me an email. If you don't even want to use chat because your name's associated with that, give me an email. Tell me what your question is. And then I'll try to make sure to sort of integrate those questions into what I do in the next class or in review or whatever. Okay, so I make notes of any questions that you submit. And I understand that, again, some of you just aren't comfortable participating. That's all right. But you can participate and be helpful in the class by at least emailing me a question. Nothing you're going to ask is going to be stupid. But some of you you have a natural sort of diffidence or shyness or whatever, and you don't want to do that in front of people. That's fine. You don't have to. But if you're not sure about something, keep in mind, you're paying me to do this, however indirectly. You deserve answers to questions if I've got them, but I won't know what they are unless you ask them. And there shouldn't be any anxiety associated with that. You should feel free to ask me any relevant question, and indeed many irrelevant questions, as I'm more than happy to answer those as well, if in fact that's possible. Anything else? All right.
I actually do have a relevant question.
What's that, Ross?
I do have a question I wanted to ask you that doesn't really pertain to what you're talking about today, but to the presidential debate a couple days ago.
Yeah.
There was just like a point in the debate where the president was asked to like denounce white supremacy, and then he didn't really do it. I always just was curious as to why that wasn't bigger, why he didn't lose more supporters, why that didn't, make a bigger impact than it did.
Well, there probably are a number of related reasons. I think the most important of which is, did it surprise anybody? I don't think it surprised anybody. Donald Trump has always kind of walked that line of, not openly advocating racism or things like that, but using a lot of kind of coded speech. A lot of the comments that he makes about saving the suburbs and things like that, if you grew up the way he and I grew up, even though what is he? I think he's 10 years older than me. Okay, but we roughly came from an analogous generation. When you started talking like that back in the 50s and 60s, you were talking about racism. You were talking about what real estate people called redlining. And he knows that because he grew up in a real estate family. So when you talked about they'll come to your suburbs and they'll, there's going to be crime and they'll bring it and they'll bring all these bad things. Everybody from that generation knows what that means. That means that white people are going to be set upon by non-white people. But because he never does it directly, remember that he was early on in 2016, a lot of you may not remember. I mean, there was a guy by the name of David Duke who had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan and then had run for the legislature. And he was asked about David Duke and purported not to know who he was. My first reaction to that when somebody asked me about that from Associated Press was, I don't know that I'd vote for anybody who was so ignorant of American history that he wouldn't know who David Duke was, because that's fairly recent. But I said, it doesn't surprise me that he would either genuinely be ignorant enough that he wouldn't know who David Duke was, or would feign that ignorance in order, not to have to really disavow that. I actually thought in some ways that Joe Biden made a mistake by even interrupting that. He should have let I would say he should have let Chris Wallace pursue that question, because as soon as Joe Biden said the thing about Proud Boys, you could see a switch was flipped, okay, that didn't help us very much. So that, because the thing about Trump is he's not a very good extemporaneous speaker. He doesn't, some people are naturally pretty comfortable speaking off the cuff without notes, and they kind of have good command of what they're saying and everything else. Donald Trump is just not one of those people. Most of us aren't very good extemporaneous speakers, okay? In that he's sort of typically American. But so when he did the thing about stand back and stand by, okay, that was interpreted, particularly by opponents of Trump, as him saying, stand by because, like stand by for your marching orders. I honestly don't get a sense that that's really what Trump meant. What it allowed Trump to do, though, that Joe Biden should have anticipated, because I sitting here in front of my TV sure as hell did, was to immediately, invoke Antifa yet again, even though nobody knows what the hell Antifa was, and FBI just says it's really nothing. that's open for debate, but also the idea that he could then start in on this whole thing about election fraud and everything else. I think it was because of that, because he so quickly diluted it by going into this whole thing of, you got to look at violence on the left and Antifa. All of his supporters, but also a lot of suburbanites who don't know what the hell's going on, read most Americans right now, really do start to believe that this Antifa is some scary left-wing organization. The analog to that in my generation was something called the Weather Underground. Okay. The Weather Underground consisted of about 7 people. Okay. They actually blew up more of their own than they did anybody else. And
Did they help get Ken Kesey out of jail or something?
It's not quite, but it was really kind of political theater that stumbled into violence. Bernadine Dorn was probably the single most radical vocal element of that. She's sort of trouncing around now as this kind of, historical figure of the left right now, even though at that time she was a laughingstock to a lot of us. We considered her a complete fraud. But the Weather Underground wasn't like a significant organization. What happened was that the COINTELPRO operation latched onto them because finally they found some left-wingers who weren't just pissed off and throwing rocks at the National Guard, but were making bombs with the plans of using them and things like that. They purported to be planning assassinations and doing this stuff. Remember, these were affluent white people being mad at mommy and daddy more than they were like thoroughgoing political revolutionaries or anything. And they got away with it too, which is kind of pathetic. But they were able under Hoover to amplify the threat of Weather Underground such that today most people really believe that Weather Underground was this big, sprawling, violent movement in the United States. The same thing is happening now with Antifa. Antifa really it's pretty much now just a bunch of pissed off, I don't know, like affluent gangbangers. They're like, they don't know anything. Most of them, when you boil down what they're really saying, they sound like right-wing authoritarians. They don't sound progressive at all. They're not Marxists. They're not even really thoroughgoing anarchists, because the last thing anarchists, would do is advocate some of the things that Antifa purports to advocate. The problem there, again, we get all this misinformation, and most of it isn't coming from Russia. It's coming from right here. Okay, and so that's why, though, Ross, is that the one thing that Trump can do is he can stir the pot and blow up the model. And he can do it. He can do that really well spontaneously. Biden should have seen that coming. He should have let Chris Wallace take that flack and just sat back and said, okay, Chris, you take this one because I ain't going there. I mean, that debate was arguably, objectively, really, I think, the worst display of political theater I've seen in my adult life, certainly in my professional life. It was the most pathetic excuse for 2 adults aspiring to the presidency that this journalist has ever seen. That is an opinion, but it is widely shared by people who've been following politics for a long time. It was disgraceful throughout. There was nothing redeeming about it, that I could find or that I've heard anyone else bring up anywhere. Did I kibitz too much, or did I address your question, Ross? I'm sorry.
No, you did.
Yeah. See, the
Thank you.
challenge there is I need to respond, and yet I don't like to just inundate you and saturate you with my opinions. I don't think my opinions are very valuable. I mean, they're mine, and I'll trot them out, but I'm trying to keep away from opinion when I'm in here, if that makes sense. Not to fake you out, but just because I don't think it's my job to teach my opinions. Okay. But that's a perfectly legitimate question. Anything else before I let you go? All right, then I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.